It's the Ute trying to inject some luxury into a segment dominated by mainstream brands. But is the Mercedes-Benz X-Class ready to rough it with the big boys?
We're heading to the Aussie Outback to find out. True Ute testing country where reliability and capability are everything. We not only want to see how they perform on a freeway or back road, but also on outback tracks, on rutted, craggy trails, and across some of the harshest, most remote terrain on the planet. Plus, we might have a bit of fun along the way. The latest Nissan Navara has been a work in progress, one that started as the NP300 a couple of years ago, but has now reverted to plain old Navara with this latest update.
The big change has been with suspension, and this is a much nicer car than it's ever been before in this generation. That said, the Navara doesn't do a brilliant job when it comes to carrying a big load. It'll do it, it's not shocking, but it's not terrific. What you end up with is some sagging in the tail, and occasionally when you're going around a corner, just like the Mercedes-Benz X-Class, it'll have a bit of a double movement, the suspension's sort of settling within its limits. Where the Navara stands out is with value, so you've got a bit more kit in the car for the same sort of money as its rivals. This one we're in, we've got leather, we've got a sunroof, so it's a few extra bits and bobs here and there. It's a nicely thought out cabin in the Navara in some ways, so you've got a very passenger car-like layout, which is familiar, I guess, for most people. You've got fantastic storage. They've got storage on top of the dash. They've got little hidey holes all over the place, so done a great job with that. I wish the steering wheel had a bit of a thicker rim to it, a bit more substance, but that said, the steering in this is pretty ordinary, too light. They need to do a bit more work on that.
This STX we're in is about $56,000, undercutting all but the Amarok on this test. The twin-turbo unit makes 140 kilowatts and 450 newton metres, and it drives through a 7-speed automatic.
The engine is a 2.3 litre 4-cylinder turbo diesel, which is relatively strong, nothing special, but it is very economical. This is pretty much the most economical vehicle we've got here, so when you're travelling big distances, you're going to be putting less fuel in the tank. It's taken a few goes for Nissan to get the current Navara right, but they're getting there, they're pretty close now.
The Volkswagen Amarok is a ute that likes to do things differently.
It's big and comfortable, so straight off the bat, the Amarok has some pretty broad appeal. You notice that in the cabin, it's a very wide, broad cabin, so you've got a bit of extra space, a bit of sprawling room. Even in the tray, you've got a bit more space. It's the only one of these utes that you can fit a pallet between its rear wheel arches. And the cabin design generally is just neat, clean, but really well done. They've put some thought into storage compartments, a really clear, concise dashboard, and just the controls are where you want them. That makes a big difference in a car like this. It's a very comfortable car as well in terms of the seating position. You've got great adjustment to the seat and the steering wheel. You've got really comfy front seats. So for big distances, it's a good car.
Earning it more points is the value. Our Core Plus model also gets sat-nav and Alcantara trim, taking the price to almost 55 grand. That's still cheaper than everything else we're testing.
The 2-litre 4-cylinder engine is the smallest in the workhorse ute segment, but it makes up to it with some extra technology. So you've got an 8-speed automatic, for example, and it works beautifully with that engine. It really does make the most out of it. The other thing you got is sequential turbochargers, so you've got a really broad spread of performance across the rev range. It doesn't really miss out on anything when it comes to performance.
That 8-speed auto helps make up for the modest outputs. There's 132 kilowatts and 420 newton metres.
In some ways too, the Amarok is a set and forget off-roader. It's got a permanent four-wheel drive system. It doesn't have low range, so when you hit the rough stuff, you're in the right mode. The Amarok's suspension is also a nice blend of being able to deal with a decent load in the tray, but also dealing with bumps and making things comfortable.
With the latest generation Ranger, Ford has gone from being an also-ran to a big ute player.
We've long been fans of the Ranger here at Drive. It's a multiple Car of the Year category winner, and it's easy to see why. It's a very polished all-rounder. It doesn't necessarily stand out in any one way, but nor does it fall flat. It's a really strong piece of kit.
It's also great value. This Wildtrak model stepping up the design and adding things such as a retractable aluminium cover for the tray. At about $62,000, it is solid buying.
You don't have to travel far around Australia to see that they've clearly set this car up for this country. It's great at long distance touring, sit on a freeway at 110, and it does it very comfortably, with one exception, engine noise. It's a little bit loud, but otherwise it does a really nice job.
That said, the engine is nicely muscled up. There's 147 kilowatts and 470 newton meters, and that torque is very easily accessible, responding quickly to throttle inputs. It's hooked up to a 6-speed automatic.
Then when you get it out into places like this, it's supremely capable. They've set the suspension up really nicely. It deals with bumps really well in terms of the way it settles the car, but on top of that, it's you can tell it's tough and it's going to go the distance. The cabin is also comfy, from the seats to the space to the driving position.
You can thank the tape measure for that. The Ranger is a big vehicle, longer than all of its key rivals. So those in the back will appreciate the extra room and the good seating position.
But the Ranger is coming up for an update, albeit a relatively mild one, but late 2018 we're expecting some changes to this car, including with the engine. So, it's a good thing now. Theoretically, it's going to get better. Probably the standout with the Ranger is that everything is just done well, done simply, and it does the job.
Holden Special Vehicles is arguably the last brand you'd expect to be building a ute, but the new HSV Sports Cat shows just how far the ute segment has evolved.
If you want to get noticed, then the Sports Cat is the car for you. It certainly stands out. You've got that tough truck stance to it, big chunky tyres, and you certainly feel, I guess, more comfortable driving along rough roads, knowing that the rubber is a bit more up to the task. It does come with compromises though, so when you're on road, there's a little bit more noise, so the comfort levels are slightly degraded. But what really affects the comfort in this car is the suspension. They've really tightened things up to make it drive better on road, and that does pay off absolutely around corners. It sits flatter than your average ute. It behaves better over larger high-speed bumps. It really ties the body down nicely. So from that perspective, they've done a terrific job. The trade-off, as I said, is you're going to feel those bumps a lot more.
Our car is running on optional Super Shock suspension, which adds external oil canisters for the dampers as well as a firmer ride. For this sort of stuff though, it is just too stiff.
Plenty of snort from the engine though. This 2.8 litre turbo diesel gets along nicely. You know it's working. It's a little bit gruff, but it's got the grunt.
The 2.8 litre 4-cylinder is a familiar unit, producing 147 kilowatts and a hefty 500 newton meters of torque, driving through a 6-speed auto. Whereas HSV has built its reputation on boosting outputs from the Holdens that they're based on, this one is identical to a regular Holden Colorado.
But the Sports Cat doesn't come cheap. Yes, the regular Colorado is a little bit of a bargain in that ute segment in terms of the features they throw at it, Apple CarPlay and so on. But by the time you get to this one, this car we're in, you're looking at $74,000. Not cheap. But it certainly stands out from the ute crowd. HSV's been very good at that in doing high performance sedans. They've nailed it again with this car. I guess the question is, does that narrow focus suit what you're after?
The Toyota Hilux has been on Australian roads for more than half a century, and it keeps getting bigger.
This current Hilux has been a terrific all-rounder, but Toyota has just narrowed in a little bit on the off-road ability of this Rugged X, the latest top-of-the-range version of the Hilux. So you've got some extra bits and bobs, things like a snorkel, a steel bar at the front with some LED lights that make for a terrific high beam, and some rock rails down the side. Also, that bumper, that front bumper, makes it easier to attack decent dips and dives like this one. So you've just got things a little bit further out of the way, which is handy.
The approach angle in particular is sharper, especially if you arrive at whatever it is you're attacking on an angle. Combined with an excellent traction control system and good ground clearance, it makes the Hilux excellent in rough terrain.
So when it comes to off-roading, this Hilux is a step above most. Only by degrees, but they've done a great job with it.
That helps offset the $64,000 price tag. Sure, you get lots of useful off-road gear, but inside it is pure Hilux SR5.
Elsewhere, not a whole lot's changed. It's still got a decent interior with a few exceptions, things like the touchscreen, too fiddly and really not suited to a car like this.
Plus, the Hilux cabin is narrower than its rivals, so space is not exactly forthcoming.
The 2.8 litre engine is stout. It's not particularly exciting. It gets the job done.
It makes 130 kilowatts, which is the least of any here. It's partially saved by the 450 newton meters of torque, which arrives nice and low in the rev range and drives through a 6-speed automatic. Less impressive is fuel use. On paper, its claimed consumption isn't bad at 7.9 litres per 100 kilometres, but in our testing it was one of the thirstiest, something that gave it the shortest driving range between refills.
And you don't have to drive it far to realise that the Hilux is up for the workhorse duties. It's got fairly firm suspension, but it's not overly firm, but it deals well with big bumps and it deals well with a load on board, so you can absolutely work it.
If you want proof that there are no longer any rules in the ute segment, then the Mercedes-Benz X-Class is it. The first ute from a prestige brand is a game changer.
If it's luxury you're chasing, then the Mercedes-Benz X-Class has it to some extent, but it's mainly with this, the badge. The other area you notice it is in refinement, quietness in the cabin. They put more sound deadening in, so for long distance touring and so on, it's a much quieter place to be. And things like the front seats, they're comfortable, they're snug, they do a good job, so again, that comfort level is a fraction up. And there are little touches in the Merc that just work. Things like the steering wheel. It's a good chunky unit, nicely designed, fits in with the overall flavour of the vehicle. And even things like these circular air vents, they've done a nice job snazzing up what is otherwise a fairly basic cabin. The engine is straight out of the Nissan Navara, so you're looking at a 2.3 litre 4-cylinder turbo diesel hooked up to a 7-speed automatic.
That means 140 kilowatts and 450 newton meters.
It does a reasonable job. It doesn't do a phenomenal job. And you notice a bit of extra weight over the Navara. That's because this car, not only that sound deadening, but it's also fractionally larger, wider than the Navara it's based on.
That weight does dull performance slightly. It's not exactly fiery. It also takes the edge off fuel consumption. Sure, the X-Class is still fairly frugal, but it uses a bit more than the Nissan.
As with the Navara, the X-Class gets a coil spring rear suspension system instead of the Leafs that are more common in utes. So that actually works nicely on road, and you get some decent compliance and it drives pretty well. Even in this sort of slower speed off-road stuff, it's good. Where it struggles is when you put a load on board. Throw some stuff in the tray and it squirms around a bit. It just doesn't suspend the car as well as it should.
Ours was also fitted with optional 19-inch wheels, which come with slightly lower profile tyres, so it transmits a few more bumps into the cabin.
The big area where the X-Class has stepped things up is with active safety. It's the only ute at the moment with autonomous emergency braking, the ability to automatically brake the car if the driver fails to. So that is a win, certainly on regular roads. Pretty useless out here, but good technology.
But you do pay for it. The X250D Power that we're in here starts at about $65,000, and by the time you add those bigger wheels and things like real leather trim and a sports bar, it easily breezes past 70 grand.
So 6 cars, all of which are extremely capable in pretty harsh terrain. None of them are perfect. But if you want the one that has the fewest issues, the best compromise between on-road and off-road ability, it's got to be one of our favourites, the Ford Ranger.